Hi, I'm Maya Van Rossum, the Delaware Riverkeeper. The Delaware Riverkeeper Network is conducting a series of interviews to take a critical look at the shale gas industry and its impacts on our environment, on our communities, and on our future. In this segment, I'm going to be joined by Leslie Sauer, who's a pioneer in the field of restoring and managing native landscapes. We're going to be talking about the effects of shale gas pipeline construction on forests, on wetlands, on our communities, as well as alternatives to the destructive construction techniques that are now used by pipeline companies.
Compaction is one of the most serious problems, and it's getting more serious because bigger and bigger equipment is being used to do this construction. Which is very problematic. It not only leads to more compaction, but it also leads to bigger and bigger rights-of-way that are needed in order to handle this kind of equipment, bigger staging areas, and that all make this problem more serious. It's interesting at a time that we see so much pipeline construction and so much concern about the damage, that actually the damage is getting worse with each pipeline rather than better. It's as if we are not learning. It probably has to do with the fact that the price of gas is falling, and it is difficult to come up with money to do this properly, and I expect to see continued pressure on doing less and less and less to restore the damage done by pipelines. When Meliora went out and measured the actual levels of compaction, we saw 77% soil compaction in the forest adjacent to the pipeline and 98% compaction in the pipeline right-of-way. That's basically what we're seeing with concrete. So in effect, these areas are being paved along the entire length. That amounts to several thousand acres on a single, on several pipelines. So it really is a very significant and dramatic change to a watershed that is not being examined at all, that goes completely without any kind of accounting at all. When you look at the ground, and the restoration sites, as they're called afterwards, you can see why vegetation is really not going to establish on these sites. There's no litter. On top of the compaction, there's very little organic matter. They put down a little netting and seed, and because it's compliance regulation, all you have to do is what you said you were going to do and what is in the regulation. There is no concern or follow-through as to whether there was any performance. Once the soils are compacted like this, rainfall can't infiltrate, vegetation doesn't get established, runoff is increased, the rate of runoff, the volume of runoff is increased, the frequency of runoff. In a woodland area, in a natural forest, you can have almost an inch of rain and there's no runoff at all. These sites start running immediately, and we see draining and dewatering of headwater areas that are no longer able to infiltrate effectively. Probably the single most important thing we can do, though, is narrow the right-of-way. In this day and age, a 100-foot wide right-of-way is unforgivable when there are lots of alternate construction techniques that allow that right-of-way to be narrower, and there are many, many examples of pipeline construction in the past with narrower rights-of-way. The first thing you will have to do is to reduce the size of the equipment used in some of the places. But this has a lot of other values in terms of not only reducing the width of the right-of-way, smaller equipment weighs less, and it puts us in a position to be able to deal with and reduce the level of compaction that we are seeing on these rights-of-way as we go forward. If you look at the slide, you will notice the equipment is elevated well above the trench, and that it's working on top of this thick cushion of spoil and wood chips. And you can see the pipe is being worked on inside the trench. As I noted earlier, this method is not always appropriate. In some terrains, this is going to be more dangerous and will not be allowable, and you'll have to go back to a 50-foot right-of-way. But when it can be done, it allows for a significant reduction in the area that is disturbed. One of the other things you will notice about this site is that there's a 34-foot right-of-way, but exactly 8 feet of it is subject to extreme soil disturbance, as opposed to 100 feet of it being subjected to extreme soil disturbance. So when I say we could have a geometric impact in terms of the reducing watershed damage, I'm perfectly serious about that, because we are not going to see destroyed soils beneath this site. You'll also see on the left of this slide the way in which the front end loader was modified with a metal wedge, a kind of, the guys kind of teased us that it looked like a pie scoop, that allowed us to lift these large sods of vegetation and stockpile them on the side, and you'll notice that it's on the other side of the trench on the slide. After the pipe was in the trench, we were just able to bring all of the spoil right back into that hole, and at that point the fencing was narrowed to the width that was going to be allowed for ongoing access. In this case it was 8 feet, which allows a repair vehicle to get through this site. In some cases it's on a sidewalk, the walkway. In other cases it is an open area immediately adjacent to the walkway where the pipeline is. But it allows for ongoing management and surveillance, but it also ensured that the equipment was not driving over the landscape that we had just very carefully restored by putting the sods back in place over the trench. You'll notice one season later in this slide, the trees are newly planted, but the ground layer has sprung back quite incredibly. These plants don't come back if the soil has been compacted to 98%. It's very clear evidence that this site really does have a stormwater infiltration capacity that is similar to the forest that was there beforehand.
So you talked about the impacts of the pipeline along the right-of-way where you have the disturbance, groundwater impacts, wetland impacts. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the harms that happen beyond the right-of-way path because of the changed vegetation, lighting, or other impacts that result.
In general, it's difficult to give an exact number of how far beyond the clearance line the impacts will be felt, but a kind of rule of thumb number that is used quite often is 300 feet, which shows you that if you have a 100-foot pipeline and 300 feet on either side of it are being impacted by what are called edge effects, you have 700 feet of forest that have been compromised. And that is a dramatic compromise. It happens for a number of reasons. Not only does the pipeline allow more light to come into either side of the forest, it also changes the wind patterns that move through the forested landscape. A lot of the invasive species are distributed by wind-dispersed seeds. You could think of a lot of the weeds that move through your own landscape, from dandelions to ragweed, and they're all flying on these seeds moving up these corridors. So they facilitate access of a lot of the seed material. And once that landscape has been opened up, it really makes it harder for those plants that are used to a dark, closed forest canopy to persist and hang on to that landscape.